Thanks for joining us here at the New America Foundation for this morning's very timely event, The Opportunities and Challenges of an Urban World. My name is Jamie Zimmerman, and I direct the Global Assets Project here at the New America Foundation. So, along with my co-hosts, the International Housing Coalition and Foreign Policy Magazine, I welcome all of you to today's event, everyone in the room, and also for those of you who don't know, we do webcast all of our events live, so I'd like to welcome everyone who's also watching over the web. In the Global Assets Project, which some of you may or may not be familiar with, we think and talk a lot about building the wealth and capital of the world's poor, marginalized and excluded populations. How do they build their savings if there's no access to banks or if they are shunned from them? How do they invest in their education and health if the schools and hospitals don't function well or don't even exist? How do they bounce back from economic shocks if there are no institutions or infrastructure in place to help them, or if those institutions are unfair or corrupt? And how do they take ownership and pride in their homes and communities if they have no property rights or lack legal empowerment altogether? How do they become productive members of society if they have no formal access to it? These aren't the only issues, or really even arguably the most poignant ones, that were discussed in Foreign Policy Magazine's excellent Metropolis Now edition. If you haven't read it or picked it up, there's some copies outside. I highly encourage everyone to grab it. It's really great. As I read it when it came out, I realized, I was thinking a lot about how we can't really begin to adequately address any of those questions about poverty and inequality that we think so much about in the Global Assets Project if we ignore the geographical, political, and economic implications of an ever-urbanized world. Does urbanization exacerbate inequalities and problems of access to goods, services, and tools necessary for individuals and communities to thrive? Or does it provide a unique opportunity that we should strive to understand and embrace? And my guess is that the answer is not black or white. It's probably both. So either way, the global development community writ large, including and particularly policymakers and the regulators and the donors, they need to consider these trends in urbanization seriously as they make important decisions about policies, programmings, and institution building worldwide. So with that said, I'm extremely excited to have this panel of experts, Peter, Billy, Larry, and my colleague Christina, here today to engage in debate and dialogue on where urbanization is headed around the world and the challenges and opportunities it presents. And I can't think of an organization better suited to lead a discussion on these issues today than our co-host, the International Housing Coalition. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to the Executive Director of the IHC, Bob Dubinsky. Bob, thanks for being here and spearheading this event with us. Thank you. No applause necessary.
No applause.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks. No applause during this event. No applause during this event. Well, I'm really pleased to be here and to partner with Foreign Policy Magazine and the New American Foundation, and it's great that those organizations are getting involved in urbanization and recognize its current importance. I just wanted to mention a few things here. The International Housing Coalition is a 5-year-old organization that was started by Habitat for Humanity, the National Association of Realtors, and the Canadian Real Estate Association to try to raise the priority of housing and urban development issues on the U.S. and international foreign assistance agenda. We would welcome new members. We have a website, www.intlhc.org. We also have, I think, an excellent paper on the challenges and opportunities that arise from urbanizations, which is out on the table here, and I hope you'll get a copy of it. It was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and I think it really shows you and presents the range of issues that are involved in urbanization, and I think recognizes the importance of urbanization as a really important phenomenon of the 21st century. One of the reasons we wanted to have this event was to have an event that celebrated World Habitat Day. World Habitat Day is an annual event sponsored by UN Habitat to recognize the importance of housing and urban issues around the world. We're lucky today to have Chris Williams here. Chris Williams is the representative of UN Habitat in Washington. He's a partner of the IHC, and he's done a terrific job over the last several years of making policy makers aware of the issue of urbanization and what should be done about it. Chris, I'd like to ask you to come and say a few words, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Bob and Peter, for continuing to keep the faith with World Habitat Day. World Habitat Week, as we tried to do a year ago. UN Habitat is an organization of the United Nations system that's basically focusing on housing and urban development issues within the UN system. It's based in Nairobi, Kenya. It's global operations and has regional offices, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and maintains operations in about 57 countries. Among the various things that UN Habitat does, as Bob mentioned, was to try to put the issue of sustainable urbanization on the radar of folks in the policymaking community, among practitioners around the world. And one of the advocacy instruments that we have is World Habitat Day, which is celebrated annually, not just in the United States, but over 70 countries throughout the world. And every year among those 70 countries, what we try to do is have one global celebration. And this took place this year in Shanghai, at the International Expo that the Chinese have organized in Shanghai. But a year ago, it took place here in Washington, D.C., and the Obama administration, very green and just in the office, decided to run with this. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the newly established White House Office of Urban Policy, as well as the State Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture, number of parts of the U.S. government put forward a very strong showing a year ago and held not only a major event at the National Building Museum on the 4th of October last year, but also a series of events like this one over the course of 1 week. And what was impressive about this showing was it was not confined to government. Over 40 different not-for-profit organizations, policy groups, private sector networks worked with government to have the celebrations for World Habitat Day. And that's why we didn't confine it to one large event, but in a sense had a number of different groups throughout the country and in Washington, D.C. celebrate. So I'm very encouraged that IHC has kept things going and organized events here. I'd also like to note that a special thanks to Habitat for Humanity International, which Representative here, Chris Vincent, had organized a major event with us a year ago, but also this year had also kept the faith by integrating World Habitat Day with what's called Carter Week. Jimmy Carter, former President, 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, who's a long-standing supporter of Habitat for Humanity International, had organized a major event that took place on, Monday and Tuesday. Actually, it's still going on in terms of having a build here in Washington, D.C. and builds throughout the United States, where they actually get in and work with voluntary groups to try to build houses in low-income communities, but also to have high-level galas, which they did on Monday night, which a number of us attended. So I'd like to special kudos to Habitat for Humanity. I'd just like to try to emphasize maybe 3 points. These colleagues will get into much more details about the substance of housing and urban development, and particularly the issue of sustainable urbanization. But I'd like to just sort of set the context for what's emerging in Washington in terms of the policy community. Congressman Miller and Price have both put forward legislation to try to deal with what they call shelter, land, and urban management issues. Senators Kerry and Durbin have also put forward legislation on this issue. Of course, these are initiatives that are part of much larger efforts to look at foreign assistance reform, which is an ongoing process that hasn't really settled. But within that larger activity, they have signaled their recognition of the interest of dealing with sustainable urbanization, dealing with helping cities manage rapid urbanization, and as mentioned by the previous speaker, the whole concept of global assets and whether this is a win-win situation or a creation of greater inequalities as people move from rural to urban areas and as existing urban populations increase, particularly in economies where there isn't economic growth. So on the legislative front, there's a lot happening. More could be done, but I just wanted to signal that there are people on the Hill that are taking this issue seriously with the backing of the Congressional Research Service and support. And I would encourage you to get more involved in that process. In terms of the State Department, their participation not only in World Habitat Day, but in a function that took place in Rio de Janeiro known as the World Urban Forum, which is another advocacy instrument of UN Habitat, has led to a number of internal discussions about what constitutes foreign diplomacy and foreign development assistance in the area of urbanization, and how, among the myriad of activities that this administration has prioritized, whether it's global health or food security or climate change, what are the urban implications of these global initiatives, and how can they better be affected if they take on board the aspect of rapid urbanization. Another network, of course, is the policy community. In addition to the folks here today, Brookings Institution, the Woodrow Wilson Center, Interaction, a group that looks at a number of NGOs that are working in the development community, are all having very serious internal discussions about wrestling with this question of urbanization. In addition, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has taken both a domestic and an international interest in urbanization. They have decided to focus very seriously on the concept of sustainable metropolitan development here in the United States as the basis for engaging international organizations in other countries in a discussion about sustainable urbanization. So as a domestic government entity with partners that are outside of government, they have gone far in looking deeply at the issue of both the climate change aspects, the economic aspects, as well as the social equality aspects of metropolitan development as the basis for contributing to a more global discussion. And they are participating particularly in an entity known as the World Urban Campaign, which is yet another advocacy instrument of UN Habitat. And it's, I think, encouraging for us to note that within the U.S. there's greater concern with this seemingly faraway global issue because it resonates very well to the urban challenges in the United States. So with those brief comments, I'd like to thank you. And again, Bob and Peter, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. That was a very, very useful overview. I'd now like to introduce the moderator of the session, Peter Kim, who's the chairman of the board of the International Housing Coalition. Peter ran USAID's Housing and Urban Development Program for 35 years, and he's a recognized urban development expert and has spent a lot of time working on urban issues, particularly issues related to slums and poor neighborhoods. Peter, I'll turn it over to you to moderate.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning, everybody. In a policy paper put forward this year, the World Bank described urbanization as the defining characteristic of the 21st century, the urbanization that's going on in the world, most of it in the developing countries. It's a very, very important event, and probably everybody here in this room has visited developing countries and seen what the slums look like and how they operate. And the fact that 1 billion people live like that sort of cries out for the world to be doing more about it. All of the international agencies have poverty alleviation as their principal objective, and a great deal of the poverty in the world can be found very dramatically if you look at the slums. The other side of the coin is that the real hope for the developing world rests in greatly accelerated economic growth. And this economic growth can only take place in these same cities. And so here we have the title of today's talk, Challenges and Opportunities. So the challenges are enormous, the opportunities are greater, and it's up to us to take advantage of them. We have a very distinguished and talented panel here. There is a nice, succinct description of the background of each of the speakers. I'll describe each of them briefly before they start speaking. Each will talk for about 10 minutes. And then at the end of that, we'll have a questions and answers period. It's a very, very complex subject which could go off in any direction. We have a very short period of time, just a little over an hour ahead of us. So I hope that we can make the best use of the talent that we've assembled. Billy Cobbett is the manager of the Cities Alliance. Billy was one of the senior officials in the Nelson Mandela administration in South Africa. He's been involved in serious urban problems all of his life. He then went on to a career in the United Nations, and the Cities Alliance, which he now heads, is probably the single organization best focused on the issues of slums in the developing countries. Christina Larson is a journalist who brings to our panel a good, fresh look at things and the capacity to articulate and express things better than perhaps the rest of us. And Larry Hanna has been a senior urban economist at the World Bank for all of his career, one of the distinguished graybeards in the field. And he'll be our wrap-up speaker. So I'd ask Billy to be the first speaker, and then we'll go ahead with 3 10-minute presentations before there's questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And with 10 minutes, I'll choose every word with care. You'll allow me the odd generalization as we cover these issues. For me, the urbanization debate is increasingly similar to the climate change debate in that there's a sense that everyone knows that it's going on. Those that don't are fighting about the trends and the statistics to see if they can disprove what's happening. We all know that the action that is currently underway is grossly inadequate. Most policymakers have a rough idea of what they need to do, but the political decisions that they have to take are very, very difficult. And we just hope that we are, in the urbanization debate, not also going to wait for the glaciers to disappear before we decide that it's time for action. But the current trends are pointing somewhat in that direction. My talk will break up the topic into 2 chunks of roughly 5 minutes each. First is the conceptual way to think about urbanization and the way in which it's happening, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia, which is where the numbers are. And secondly, I'll try and focus on the practical I'm going to detract from the pleasures of scaring you with the numbers, because actually they're out there in the public domain. We don't need to cover them again. You either believe them or you don't, or you either go back and look at the Google photographs and see what cities looked like 20 years ago and imagine what they're going to look like 20 years from now. And so my focus is very much on not non-metropolitan cities, on secondary cities, which is, and that's the first headline, where the bulk of urbanization is taking place and will continue to take place. And of course, that's where the resource challenges are the most intense. So I try to ask and answer the questions in a conceptual or political framework. What should we advise policymakers to do? So we get frame something for practical action. And I think the first challenge, and it's still missing in the public debate, is to accept urbanization as a fact. And this is still being debated as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. My view is it's a thing. It's out there, it's going to happen, it's happening. And we need to bring this acceptance of urbanization into the formal planning and budgetary process of national governments, of development agencies, and of course at local government, which is where the bulk of urbanization is going to be managed. In other words, this is an on-balance sheet topic, and that is how it needs to be dealt with. Core business year after year. That means, in terms of the practicalities of it, we need a better handle at a local level of the facts, the data, and the trends. Too many mayors don't know who's in their city, how big their city is, where the population came from, how poor they are. So we really need evidence-based policy making to deal properly with urbanization. The second subcomponent of this first challenge is to enlist and empower local government, because it is really a global challenge, yes, but it is going to be locally managed. and it is in small towns, the names of which you don't know, where this urbanization is taking place for the last 2 decades and in the next 3 or 4 decades. And in that sense, therefore, we need to focus on, and this is for me a major point, on a system of cities, as the World Bank in its same policy document that Peter referred to suggests, because ultimately future economic growth is going to be highly dependent on how efficient cities are, and cities trade with cities and need to connect with cities. And this at least is something that has been well understood on the East Coast in China. So the first challenge is to accept urbanization and bring it formally into the planning process of private and public authorities. The second and associated challenge is to adopt longer-term and more flexible planning frameworks. Up until now and continuing, the planning profession and planning and associated professions are very, very rule-bound, focused on control and regulation, and drawing pretty pictures on maps, which is not how urbanization or cities are growing. We need to have a far more flexible approach that is responsive to the dynamics of urbanization. And a very practical example of this would be in so many of the cities that we deal with, we have this complete mismatch between municipal boundaries, in other words, the jurisdiction, and the functionality of the city. And so the jurisdiction is one thing, and the reality of the city is something else. And so it is very difficult to govern a city when your administrative and jurisdictional boundaries are not aligned, which is a big feature. And then the third, and this is one I think where city managers find it most difficult, is that we have to, and they should, accept current informality as a reality. That is what our cities look like at the moment. This is the starting point. And you can call them slums, and you can call them informal areas, and you can call them illegal. That is where we begin. We need the response to informality or illegality or slums is to introduce policies that systematically are designed to incorporate and to formalize over a period of time. And that is how cities will change in the future. There is, if I have to say one thing, is to stop looking for the magic, the silver bullet that's going to fix it. This is the dull stuff of good governance that will change cities. So if we can get it into our mindset that the challenge at a household level is to ask what policies will help the shack become a house in the way that we understand it formally. What policies will help the slum become a suburb of a future city? Because if you go back and read your history of cities that we now photograph and love, that's what happened. It's just in previous centuries. And therefore, one of the consequences of this is accepting, in the case, for example, of shelter delivery, we have the current situation where the vast majority of housing stock in the world today is already produced, not by the formal sector and not by the private sector, but by the poor themselves. And that, in my view, should be a central plank of formal housing policy. Stopping the poor building their house and work out how to help them do it better formally as part of on-balance sheet budgeting. So all of the above requires changes in political debate, in behavior, and repetitive positive action over time. No magic, just good policies, well thought through and consistently followed. What are the practicalities? So that's the climate within which policy making I propose should take place. What are the practical things that a city manager, a mayor, or a national minister needs to promote? And I want to just focus in 10 minutes on 3 broad challenges which are fairly universal. And the first is everyone's favorite, is the dysfunctional urban land markets that dominate most countries and most cities. If I had to identify, besides the mindset, the practical obstacle number 1, it is the functioning of urban land markets. Why? They don't function. They are normally hugely dysfunctional. So what we need to achieve is easier said than done because this is tied up with politics, power, and patronage. Open and functioning land markets where we know who owns the land, how they got it, and how it can be transferred. Open access to information and easier transferability of land and release of land. We have in most cities outdated regulation controlling the land markets, a prime example of which would be, for example, India. We need to have citywide view that looks at the overall economic, environmental and social health of the city rather than just that small little parcel of land. In other words, a citywide planning view is absolutely essential. A point that I've often made is that if you have a city that is 40% or 50% slum, you don't have a slum problem. There's something fundamentally wrong with your city, and you need to rethink the city in its entirety. You can't solve slum problems in slums alone, because that's not where the problem is. It's much wider. We also need to have land market policies that allow for improved, which means increased densities, and particularly a focus on the location of the urban poor. Thus far, the dominant de facto policy is that the poor get displaced to either the most dangerous land. Think of the floods in Manila where the river Pasig, it's covered with slum dwellers living along the side of the river or along the side railway tracks or motorways or rivers or canals. Throughout Asia, that's where the slum dwellers are found. This is not good planning. This is not sensible location. Or we take price as the prime determinant of where the poor are located and therefore as far as possible from the city center, and therefore adding to the long-term dysfunctionality of the city as a whole. So challenge number one, land markets. Challenge number two is for local governments and national governments to gradually formalize the provision of essential and other services to the entire population of that city. At the moment, and as part of that, so we have the existing backlogs, which are already a challenge, but even beyond that is the even greater challenge politically of getting local policymakers to plan for future provision and future growth. Again, which evidence-based policymaking would allow you to think about. Obviously, the services that I'm referring to primarily start with water, sanitation, solid waste, and energy, as well as essential services of a softer kind like health and education. The absence of dealing with this on a formal basis leads to huge price distortions within markets, which the simple outcome of which is that, as a general rule, when the services are not provided formally, the poor pay more for the same unit of water or electricity or rent as the wealthier do in the same city. In other words, all of the burden goes on to those that are not formally provided. It also leads to the creation of parallel markets, which means if you can't get it through the local authority, you'll get your water by some other means because you can't survive without water. Similarly, for water, for electricity, for disposal, or there is no disposal, for energy. So we've seen in all the slums you see electricity hot-wired, but far more worrying for the longer-term safety and security of that city is parallel markets, and the failure of the local authority ultimately give rise to parallel systems of governance. If you, the local authority, don't provide, someone else will, and that puts them in a position of power and authority over those that are receiving. Don't understand what I'm talking about? Come to the Brazilian favelas and see who runs the slums. It's not the local authority. And that's the unintended consequence of the failure of the local authority to provide. So the essential point that informality and illegality, which we may rail against, actually ends up empowering the slumlord, weakens civil authority, it weakens the rule of law, or can do, and ultimately weakens the poor. And the third practical step is maybe the most important and is a requirement for all of the above, is to recognize the permanence of the urban poor and to act accordingly. And that's the mindset that I think has been missing up until now in too many of the policy responses that we've seen in too many countries, which means by recognizing something called an urban citizenship. The right, small r, I'm not making a big argument here about rights, but the right of the poor to have access to the opportunities and, of course, the responsibilities that come with being a part of a long-term community and a local authority. On the one hand, that means allowing for opportunities for employment. So often we see local authorities destroying, but not offering alternatives, the informal trading that takes place in so many cities and which keeps the market alive. It's by far the biggest creator of jobs in Africa at the moment or in South Asia is the informal market. That needs to be recognized. It's the same argument about the informality and then slowly and gradually bringing it in to the formal sector. The extension of other municipal services, which are almost never in the public debate. For example, security. Where are the police forces going in protecting slum dwellers? Most of the time, the police forces are protecting everyone else against the slum dwellers. So it's rethinking entirely how the city works. So a gradual process of identifying and extending rights and responsibilities. So what I've described in 10 or 12 minutes, I hope, he hasn't kicked me yet, is a gradual process of incorporating and inclusion, of formalizing the informal. That is what city managers and planners and architects and policymakers and budget makers are going to be doing for the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. And that is how cities will be created, and that is how societies will stabilize. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks to everybody for being here. My name is Christina Larson. I'm an editor at Foreign Policy Magazine and a Schwartz Fellow here at the New America Foundation. We have copies of the issue, as I believe Jamie mentioned, Metropolis Now, which is an issue devoted to urbanization and global cities. The first question I wanted to address was why foreign policy would talk about urbanization. One of the things that we try to do is bring different ideas, different schools of thought into questions of foreign policy, to expand the realm of considerations and to mix up ideas and to try to do innovative things beyond issues that you normally think about in terms of the foreign policy realm. It's one of our best received issues, and we've just been thrilled with the response and some of the questions it's generated, including a discussion like this. So thanks to all for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the city of Chong Chang and about urbanization in China. One of the articles in this issue is a piece that I did. It's a profile of the city of Chong Chang. Chong Chang is a city in central China. You might not have heard of it now, but I expect you'll be hearing more and more about it in the coming years. It's a city of 32 million people. That's more than the entire population of Iraq. In China, there are more than 50 cities of more than 1 million people. In the United States, there's only 10. So there are these cities that in a few decades we'll think of as sort of like the Chicagos and the San Franciscos of China that'll have their own personalities and their own role in China's economy and also increasingly in the global economy that we're just now beginning to peek into. And so I went there to try to take this abstraction of a megacity down to something that we could relate to make it a little bit more human. Quite often when we hear about China and see images of China, we just see these vast new skyscrapers, these images of the Shanghai Expo, the impeccable Beijing opening ceremonies for the Olympics, and we think, my goodness, they have everything so planned. And it makes us awestruck and a little bit nervous about what's going on in China. But for those of you who've been in China, you know that the reality is a lot more chaotic. There's a lot more improvisation. There's a lot more serendipity It's a wonderful place to visit. It's a place that when you, if you do visit, you can sort of relate to the openness and the optimism of the people. But for purposes of a panel like this, I think it's also important to talk about some of the challenges that people in China see in their own urbanization. Again, if on this side of the pond we have this image of everything going so smoothly in China, there people in China will say, we're very proud of what our country is doing, but before you worry about us supplanting America in any sort of global sense, we've got some important challenges to focus on ourselves. And most of those are urbanization challenges. As a friend of mine put it, when President Obama gets his morning brief, there's a lot from the State Department and the CIA, foreign issues, and when Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao get their morning briefs, there's a lot about urbanization, social, political stability issues, because they're really focused on their own country, as well as, of course, their role overseas. Just again, to give a little texture to this debate, and to try to maybe give us something we can visualize a little bit more, I wanted to talk about some of my experiences in the city of Chongqing. When you first come into Chongqing, I flew into Chongqing. There's a new airport. They're expanding, building a third terminal, increasing international flights to Chongqing. You drive into the city, and it's just row upon row of these brand new, sparkling buildings, and you think, my goodness. But then when you walk around the city, of course, you don't have slums on the outskirts of the city so much as you do in other countries like India. But you have really rundown areas in the center of the city where a lot of the day laborers come and they live, and there is not running water, there's terrible sanitation. So at the one time you have these sort of shiny new buildings, you also have this great discrepancy. And China is one of the places where inequality is increasing fastest. One of the reasons is because a lot of these people who are moving into the cities for economic opportunities, they're not formally incorporated into the education system, the legal system. There's a hukou household system in China that denotes your ability to enroll in school, enroll your children in school, and to participate in social services that doesn't transfer simply because you move yourself. So a lot of people who've just come into cities don't have these sort of rights extended. Another thing I did want to point out about these great shining mega block cities, this is a picture. You've probably seen these great buildings. I visited some people who lived there, and a lot of them had factory jobs or service jobs, and they talked to me about how the fact that we've got this place to live. It's a lot nicer than where we lived before. Many of them came from the village. But there weren't schools there yet. There weren't hospitals there yet. So that we have these, just because they have a place to live, doesn't mean that they have these other services that we expect. And again, this is one of these images. When we see these pictures of China, we think, my goodness. But the story, when you're there, is a lot different. And it's also a question of priorities and governance. There's a lot of new buildings that are going up in cities like Chongqing. Chongqing has a new opera house that's several $1 million. It's designed by a foreign architect. And mayors of cities in China often prioritize these big showpiece projects that they can put their name on above urban housing development. Bois Shalai is the vice secretary, is the party chairman of Chongqing. He's a up-and-coming political figure in China. He's rumored to be a contender for the Politburo in the future. And, of course, he's going to want his name on one of these big, fancy projects, like an opera house. He doesn't want the Bois Shalai affordable housing complex, right? So you don't have the kind of political will or incentive to address these issues at the moment in China. I should say that there's some city leaders who, for whatever reason, do take an interest in the urban poor, but it's very sort of different in each city in China how they're developing. I think that's another important point. I also wanted to talk about how family structures are altered with urbanization in China. One of the fellows that I met, he came from a small village. He had gone to school in Beijing, to college. He had then gone to West China to participate in sort of China's sort of equivalent of the Peace Corps, so he had this sort of altruistic sense. And so he then came back to Chong Chang, which was the closest big city to where he had grown up, and he's actually working for an environmental NGO, which is something that, of course, wouldn't have existed several years ago. His parents have moved into his apartment with him because that's the only way they can all afford things. And he says that even in a city of 32 million people, his parents are so lonely because for centuries they lived, you had sort of informal social networks and care structures that developed in villages, and that's not immediately transferred in any way when people move into cities. And you don't have communal places to visit. Again, I'm talking a bit about China. It might be different in other cities, but the Chinese government discourages a lot of informal markets and other things. So they're in this great sort of new building, but if they walk outside, there's car dealerships and there's shops selling this and that. There's no place really for them to meet other people. It was on an emotional level, that was one of the most striking things. And I also wanted to bring that up because I think it is a really good example of the paradoxes of urbanization in China and in anywhere else. I mean, how can you be lonely in a city of 32 million people? How can you feel uncertain about your future if you've come from a place in the countryside where you really were living very, very sort of hand to mouth as a farmer, and now you have this again, what seems from the outside to be such an improvement, but it also raises a whole other set of questions. And then again, the sort of paradoxes of political incentives in China and the things that the people who are mayors of cities and party secretaries want versus what a lot of the people who are moving into the cities want. And I guess the last point that I would make, which again is specific to China, though it might apply in some ways elsewhere, is that the mayors of cities and the party secretaries are appointed from Beijing. And they're appointed for a period of time, and then they're transferred elsewhere. So quite often their incentive is to, again, erect big buildings, to do fancy things, to announce big plans, to get a lot of attention. They aren't there for the decades-long haul. They aren't people who've come from that community, understand that community intimately. And they don't have a vested interest in making sure that the opera house they built actually has patrons in the 10 or 20 years after that. Again, I do want to say that our image of, sometimes our stereotype of, corruption in China is definitely true. There are some remarkable individuals that I've met, for example, in the city of Shenyang in northeastern China. They're doing some really wonderful things trying to improve the environment of the city. I come back to environment because that's one of my sort of focuses. In the Q&A, if you guys want to ask about sustainable development in China, that's something I could talk a bit about. But I just really want to emphasize the variance of what's happening in China, the sense that from these pictures and our awestruck image of China, we don't get a full sense of what's happening, and finally this sense of paradoxes. So, thank you.
Peter, you ready?
Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I don't know whether their webcast needs to be adjusted. I'm going to stay sitting here because one of my jobs is to kind of take what you've heard from the others and put it back in a framework. And if I stand up and can't read my notes because they're not at the right focal length for me, that won't be very useful to you. So I want to start by thanking the New America Foundation, the IHC, and Foreign Policy Magazine, which we've all been long and loyal readers of, for hosting this event today. I think that the full room here, and I hope what is a large crowd out there watching this on the web, and most of you I realize I don't know, is really, to me, evidence of how much this subject has become a central part of the way we think about the world, and particularly in the United States, part of the debate on what foreign policy and development assistance should look like. So I'm just very encouraged by the fact that you're all here and that we have this panel today, and we're hosted by these organizations. I'm going to talk about three questions, and I'll try and refer to what the others have said, or three kind of ways of organizing it. I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about the history of urban development and how people have in the development community at least, have thought about that. Then I'm going to talk for a moment about kind of contemporary thinking. What's new and what have we learned? And finally, I'll end up on where does that leave us on challenges going forward. So that's my 3 points. I think that if you go back and read the development literature in the post-World War II period, you'll find at the outset almost no discussion of urban development at all. Development problems were focused on rural issues. They were focused on agricultural productivity, the Green Revolution. And part of this is just the numbers. As recently as 100 years ago, only about 15% of the world was urbanized. So this is a very recent phenomena in the long span of history. And the views that were expressed about urbanization were almost universally negative. This was thought of more as a problem on an issue that created problems. There were real debates about whether there was any economic benefit of more people moving to the cities. And in fact, the movement itself was considered probably the result of a policy bias rather than any kind of opportunity. Urbanization policies, to the extent that they existed, and this is even true for a country like China, were basically about how to keep people from moving to cities, how to control the size of cities, or where to place people. You know, we want so many cities of this size. So when you go back and look at urbanization policies, they either didn't exist or they were mostly these kind of negative control policies. What happened? Urbanization, when you read any of the demographic stories, the economic stories, it pretty much continued apace. There wasn't these policies, probably fortunately, that were designed to stymie urbanization largely failed. I think the other observation we would make historically is that the quality of urbanization, which is the phrase we would use now, was not very good. And this is pretty much the story that Billy told you, that we have large part of the developing world story of urbanization leaves out many people and leaves a very large and disconnected informal sector. The other thing that historically looks quite different than today is the relative roles of national and local governments. I would say that local governments took national policies as a given, whether they were about finance, property rights, anything. And as you all know today, that's no longer the case at all. The kind of obligations that cities took on largely had to do with services, and again, services in a traditional or quite narrow sense, the traditional public services, whether it be water, roads, drainage, not much beyond that. And the kind of planning they did, I guess today we would characterize it as kind of sequential or very unintegrated planning. And this, I'm not really talking about history here in the sense that we don't even today see many places that kind of integrate such issues as, say, land use and transport planning. So let me talk about what's new, and I'll finish up my talk today by mentioning some publications you may want to look at if you'd like to hear a little bit more about this. Peter mentioned this phrase that I like very much too, that urbanization will be the defining characteristic of the 21st century. It actually is most recently used in a World Bank publication. And almost all of the urbanization, the common number that's understood is 90%, will occur in the developing world. So we're finished this process in the rich world. Actually, parts of the developing world are largely complete too, such as Latin America. I think Billy's point that the starting point for good policy and good development for the world is to recognize this as the defining phenomena and to build policies around that. In my mind, the most important development in terms of thinking about urbanization is where the work on agglomeration economies or the link between urbanization and growth has taken us. And I think the economists have understood for a long time why kind of physical proximity was a source of efficiency, also that people enjoy what is commonly called consumption benefits from living in cities. But what they didn't understand, and is really quite recent in the research, is how strong the correlation, and I wouldn't go so far as to yet call this causality, but the correlation between urbanization and development is. I think the phrase of a book that I brought along for you to look at, and you can obtain it, I think you can obtain it from the World Bank bookstore. It's from the Growth Commission. The phrase they use, and it's quite remarkable to me, is no country has ever reached middle income status without a significant shift of its population to cities. So that's a pretty strong statement. This book and several others I'll mention to you really have refocused the debate on the relationship between agglomeration economies, urbanization, and growth. I guess the overall catchphrase that we see today on this is that cities are the engines of national economic growth, and I think that was kind of part of the message that Christina was giving us. It's pretty obvious to anyone who's been to China. The kind of academic consensus on this is that it's not a sufficient condition. You can't simply urbanize and expect your economy will grow, and it's not a condition. It is a condition to sustain growth. There's no country that's managed to get its growth up and then keep it there without being urbanized. The third point I would make under this contemporary thinking is about the role of cities. I guess the agenda for leadership at the local level worldwide now is quite different than it was as recently as 20 or 30 years ago. I think Christina's comment there that one of the challenges for a country like China is that the system by which local leaders are appointed doesn't really create the kind of local accountability that is probably essential to carry out modern functions. Let me just mention how differently people talk about this now than they did in the past. This idea of planning is no longer kind of finishing the grid or finishing the network. It's much more kind of the economic consequences of how you put these things together. As soon as you move to topics like environment, to the efficiency of cities, you can immediately see how many different issues you have to bring to the table. When people think about delivering services, they don't think about this in kind of simple engineering terms anymore. It's, in fact, I would say the focus of much of the discussion is really about two things. One is how to pay for them, and as you all know, everything from private sector involvement to explicit pricing of services is a phenomena that has swept the world in the last generation, and it remains the focus of people who plan for these services. The other challenge, which is most important in the developing world, is inclusion. How to bring these services to all the population, and I think Billy's remarks this morning reminded us of how important that is. But then there are all these new things that cities do now that we never even had terminology before to describe. I guess the one that appeals to me most is this idea that local governments have a role in making the business climate friendly in their jurisdiction. I don't think I ever read an article that's older than 10 years ago that talked about local economic development in terms of business environment. Instead, it would talk about, did we put the road to the factory? Can they get water, and can they hook up the electricity as soon as they're ready to go? You'll find now when you read the development literature that there's a huge focus on business environment. I'm always amazed at the success of this effort called Doing Business, which is an annual report done by a part of the World Bank. it's actually quite narrowly about starting business and how long that takes and how many steps you have to go through. But it shows you how much people have changed the way they think about the role of national, but particularly local government in fostering economic development. So that's, to me, one of the other major changes in the way we think about this. Finally, let me turn to the challenges as I see them. I would start by seconding Billy's comment that we won't go anywhere until people accept the idea that urbanization is going to continue to happen and it's going to be the organizing paradigm at the middle of the development process. We ask ourselves, I think often, what should urbanization policy look like, or what should its objective be? Actually, there are almost no countries that have anything that you would call a national urbanization policy. We have the legacy policies, which are how can we stop urbanization or slow down migration to the cities, or maybe in some countries even get people back out of the cities. A few people have tried that. But positive urbanization policies are really quite limited. My nomination would be some kind of phrase about increasing the efficiency of the transformation from rural to urban societies. That would be the way I think about that. And that's, of course, made up of the standard components of policies. And I, again, endorse Billy's comment that land market policies are pretty much at the core of this. How do you pay for things, and how do you manage the process? There are three challenges that I would put as at the top of the list going forward, and perhaps this will kick off our discussion. One is this story about how do we, this engines of growth, cities or urbanization of engines of growth, how do we take this idea forward? What do cities need to do? Do we have the knowledge to move on this? Again, Billy's comments that we, rather than kind of impressions or views of what we like or what we don't like, we need some good evidence-based conclusions or research to take our work from. I guess the other engines of growth story that's relevant for most of the developing world is this idea that the informal sector is in fact a very productive part of the economy in developing countries, and the policies, and I like Billy's phrase this morning too on this, is bringing the informal society into the mainstream, to break down that barrier and join them is really the theme. The second question I would say as a major challenge is this idea of what the role of cities should be. And I mentioned some of the new things they do. I'm sure we're going to be talking about environment, what's the role of cities on climate change. It's one of those areas where we see the pyramid almost turned upside down. Groups of cities now, including a number in this country, have actually taken the lead away from the national government on these issues, and collectively are setting the national and to some extent the international agenda. I think all of us are quite cognizant of the role that local governments play in disaster management. So I would say thinking about things like business environment, local economic development, what role do cities have in employment, how do they, what kind of structures do they need to have fiscal viability, what does it mean to have a livable or city or a high quality of life, what kind of distributional responsibilities do they have. I think this remains one of the big blocks going forward for challenges. And the final one I'd like to mention is sustainability. I think this is a greatly overused word, but the concept isn't we haven't run out of usefulness for the concept yet at all. And I think we have to think, this of course generally is thought to have originated on the environment side, but I think now if any good talk on sustainability kind of starts with this triangle of kind of economic, and I would say economic and fiscal, social and environmental paradigms, and it's the story of how you fit those things together. And an example of what do we mean by kind of social inclusion as part of a sustainability concept, I think it's this inclusion of the informal sector. Again, I refer to the remarks that Billy made earlier, that you can't solve slum problems in the slums themselves. The economic and fiscal challenges are enormous, and but fortunately there are a lot of, the variation of experimentation on how to finance urban development is a whole subject in itself we could spend the day on, but maybe people will have some questions. But I think if you don't have a good economy, if you live in an environment, maybe as some of us are now, where nobody wants to pay for anything, especially if it's a public good, it's hard to imagine how you can make your city a better place and a more prosperous place to live going forward. I also see a great role in moving on this agenda as part of the sustainability focus of more flexible and integrated planning. So let me end up by mentioning a few publications you might want to look at, and you're probably familiar with most of them. I actually think the one that is this one I brought here with you. It's called Urbanization and Growth, and it's a publication of something called the Growth Commission, and it's this whole volume. This is actually about a 30-volume piece of work done over 2 years by Nobel laureate Michael Spence. But this particular one is only on urbanization, and if you've only got time to read one book, take a look at this one. If you only got time to read one article, read the introduction to this one. It's the best piece on that. The other general framework which puts all these pieces together in a far better way than I could ever do is the World Development Report of 2009, which talks about economic geography. And I think that's again become often cited. UN Habitat's got an excellent piece, and it's a biannual piece they do called The State of the World Cities. But the most recent one has the subtitle, and I'm looking at Chris here, Bridging the Urban Divide. And you can imagine that's all about urban citizenship and what inclusion means. And it's a very nice publication. It's published in 2010. IHC's publication, which is out there. And if you're particularly interested in China, I refer you to the most recent work of probably the top urban economics scholar in the United States, Vernon Henderson. He's a professor at Brown University. But this publication, you can find it on the NBER website, National Bureau of Economic Research. And I think it's just called Urbanization in China, but it's very thoughtful. It'll challenge many of the ideas you have about China, and it's evidence-based. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so we averaged about 13 minutes, which is pretty good. No prompt from the chair and just self-discipline. We'll settle for that. This is a question and comment period. Alina will carry a microphone around. Remember, this is being streamed, so we need to communicate with the outside world. Please identify yourself and your organization and ask succinct, brilliant questions. That may have been the wrong thing to say.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on empowering women through microfinance, and we are looking out into shelters. We are working with a solution, a group that we collaborate. We are into green solution for affordable housing in the city, fighting the homeless in the city. This organization has been approved by the USAID, even had contract with FEMA for affordable housing, but we have never got any place we can construct this affordable, portable housing for fighting shelters. Instead of people staying in shelters, we want them to stay in this affordable housing, starting from here in the District of Columbia, where we have 10,000 people waiting on a waiting list to get houses where they can live. So we're trying to get this solution built in the city, but we have no way. We're looking for funding. Initially, I'm from Kenya, looking of where I come from. I think those who have the offices in Kenya, we have so many slums in Kenya. And we said affordable housing. We are also trying to go to Kenya and other countries using the straw from rice, straw from wheat, and straw from millet and sorghum, which will also create jobs and have people and families use the same food. So if you can help.
Do you have a question for someone on the panel?
Yes, how can we get funding for this affordable housing in this city and internationally? Thank you.
There's an easy one. Anyone want to?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you're going to take a few, or would you like to address them?
All right. Well, let's get to it.
I have a comment already.
That's a good suggestion.
I'll save time, I think.
Yeah. No, that's a good
We
suggestion.
got our notes here, real quick.
We can mix it up. Whereas Larry needed to stay seated in order to read his notes, I rose to defend myself from my notes.
Hi, good morning. I'm Steve Senna from TCG International, and I think it may be a related question. One of the things I didn't hear mentioned much, except by Larry a little bit with regards to services, is how to get the private sector involved, or how they are involved internationally. In the U.S., TCGI is a bit unique in that we work with HUD programs nationally, Hope 6 in particular, and the newer programs that are coming out. And we also work, we do work with USAID internationally. So one of the things that we've seen is that the Hope 6 model, which leverages a lot of local private and civil society assets, is one that that has good track record in the U.S. And I'm wondering, with regards to private sector participation, what your thoughts are on the panel in terms of leveraging both private sector funds, but also the resources of civil society, nonprofits, NGOs, whether they're very local or internationally funded. That's the Hope 6 model. It leverages, it uses essentially what we could call donor funds from HUD, and it combines that with local resources from the city governments, potentially state governments, and also these private sector and civil society. And that may be a way that the program the woman was referring to could participate in a broader program as one small component. Thanks.
Okay. Full disclosure, I'm an advisor to TCGI. Maybe two more questions, and then we'll throw it back to the panel.
Good morning. My name is Alvaro Escardo. Someone on the panel had mentioned how the first wave of urbanization in Western cities, the slums went to being good, nice-looking houses. So this and how some of these lessons can be applied to the cities of today, but this assumes that there's a sort of linear model of urban development, which a lot of the cities in China, for example, and other cities growing today are developing in a very different way from those Western cities of 150 years ago, 200 years ago. So I was wondering, in what important ways should we take note of how they're developing differently, and what implications this has for how we can address the slum situation? And in regards to formalizing the informal, I was also wondering what the panel's thoughts are on the proposals by the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, who he talked about giving titles to people in slums and also formalizing the markets and the businesses by giving them corporate corporate statuses, so that this way bring them into the formal business network. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jane Katz from Habitat for Humanity. Thank you. It was a great panel. My question really relates more to technology and the impact of technology on the growth of cities and urban areas. And I'm thinking, now that a lot of slum dwellers have iPhones and various ways of paying their bills, and what would change with the growth of technology in cities? And then along the same lines, when Christina was talking about the families being somewhat isolated, and I'm wondering how social networks play into that whole effort.
Elena, let's get one more. Right in.
Okay, my name is Chong Chang. I'm a historian, but I have been studying urban housing conflict in Shanghai in the past 6 years. And my question is for Christina. The question is, how do I address the emotional trauma generated by the displacement and the social injustice? Because I have been interviewing those people in the past 6 years. Some of them actually have housing. Some of them, in some cases, the government actually want to solve their housing problem. But just because they were displaced and they were evicted, and they fear that they were treated unjustly. So they just don't want to stop petitioning. Some of them have been petitioning for decades. It's the loss of emotional property, not just the physical property, that they couldn't find a replacement. And what can we do to address it?
Okay, so Christina, you were asked a specific question, so why don't you start and we'll work our way across the panel. You can answer whichever of the questions you would like to answer, or some other question if you would rather.
Make up your own.
Would you rather answer that?
Great. Thanks for all the questions. I took notes on some of them, so I'm just going to go chronologically to ones that I think I have something to add to. There was a question about nonlinear models of urbanization, okay? So how are cities in China or India or other places developing differently than, I think we could take it further than 100 years ago. London, how did London become a big city of more than 1 million, and how is that different? Again, I'm speaking mostly from the perspective of China. One thing is just speed, the rate at which things are happening. There's a sense, in the city of Chong Chang, okay, more than 1 million people become urban residents there every year, and they're projecting that that's going to be the case at least for the next 10 years. So just in terms of the scale of what's needed, I think that what's happening in some places is quite different. When cities grow up over a longer period of time, it's my sense that they grow up more organically, that you have more of a sense of neighborhoods, that people who have common job functions move to certain areas. What I've seen in places in China is, again, that structures are being built. And sometimes it's the case that new sort of mega block structures are being built, and then people are populating them. And is China or Chinese local governments, are they building the actual structures for the people who are going to come there? I won't take up too much time, but I did want to go back to the Opera House and say, that's being built for the expectation that suddenly there's going to be a very sophisticated middle class in the city of Chong Chang, and at this point, I spent a lot of time, I was talking to developers who are pretty wealthy. They're saying, what arts and culture exhibits do you go to, and what do you think of the latest showings at the Opera House? And nobody had actually been there. So that, again, are you building the structures that the people who actually live in the city need? It's a different, these are questions that I think are different when the rate of people moving into the city is different. Someone had asked about the role of technology in the growth of cities. Again, China right now is just this wonderful experimentation. There's a lot of places in I hope I can expand this, talk about rural areas or some not huge cities but smaller towns where you have a lot of solar water heaters that are used for showers and for hot water. So there's examples where you have new technology that wasn't available in the West 50 years ago that are being used in innovative and positive ways in China. It's true that people have cell phones, that it's much easier to communicate information quickly. I'm not sure how that, because again, in China, most things are happening bottom down rather than top up. So having more people at a lower level with access to information changes their lives, changes the way they think about things, changes in some ways their ability to access information from the outside world, which I think is important in terms of how it shapes expectations. I don't know that it changes the way urban planning happens, but I'm not sure. I do know that people in the city of Chongqing use their cell phones to send information about which factories have problems, which factories have the highest or lowest wages, so that people are trying to expand what they see as their job opportunities, even at a fairly low skill level through new technology. So that's one thing that wouldn't have happened some time ago. Again, people have more sense of what their options are, even if they aren't empowered really to plan. There was a question about families and social networks. This is a huge, huge, huge concern in China. So many people I've talked to have said, for the next 20 years, boy, China is amazing. And after that, And the reason is demographics. Like, as you know, China, there's a big question whether China will be the first country to grow old before it grows rich, because of the one-child policy and because of the cost of having children in urban areas, and because of a number of other reasons, it used to be the case that when people got old in China, they would have a big family structure to support them in their old age, and less that's the case, and that's a big concern now, and it's becoming an increasing concern in the future. And that's just an example of where the dissolution of a family structure or traditional family structure, and not knowing exactly what's going to replace it, is causing a lot of concern. I mean, of course, it's the case that people, when they move to a new environment, they do find ways to relate and connect to the people around them. There's a lot of neighborhoods in cities in China that people who are from the same ethnic group congregate in one place, similar to, I guess, sort of like a Little Italy in a city in the U.S. Sometimes people don't realize it, but China is a lot more ethnically diverse, especially in the West, where a lot of the development and urbanization is happening, than we sometimes recognize. And so people come from different parts of the country who have similar sort of characteristics, often similar culture, similar food, all live in the same place. So again, that's something that I think will certainly happen bottom up rather than top down, how people form new kinds of social bonds. And then the last question that I was asked to address was this question about the emotional trauma. And really, I think part of what you're identifying is the fact that there's not really an appeals process or a sensible, logical, transparent way for people with grievances about how urbanization is affecting their lives and their communities to make those voices, to make those concerns heard and to see them addressed. It's one thing to raise a concern and not have anyone respond. Certainly that happens in a democracy. It's another thing if your concerns aren't able to be expressed. That's something that I absolutely sympathize with, the importance of recognizing. It's, even some of the best intentioned urban planners in China do not really know or connect with those for whom they are allegedly planning, because they don't have city halls, they don't have they don't have representatives. It is the case that you have some sort of neighborhood representatives, but it isn't a sensible or coherent way of having concerns that arise at the bottom be known to people who are planning and allocating resources at the top. I do think, per a question about, or per I think it was Billy's wonderful statement about how if you have informal areas of a city that exist sort of outside of the official governance, that you have alternate structures of governance form. I think in some ways China, by not having formal ways to include people, especially people like migrant workers who really don't have any rights, of course you're going to have leaders within those communities arise and strive for ways to make their voices felt, sometimes effectively if they happen to be someone who is an extraordinary individual who somehow gains the faith of a community about, let's say, a pollution or another problem, and figures out how to make their voices held, usually informally by connections with officials. But that's certainly the exception and not the rule. So I don't have an answer for you except to say that you've pinpointed a really important dynamic of urbanization, and something that's hard to talk about on purely a policy level. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a broad range. So I'll start off with a question about the how to engage with the private sector, because I think it's a key. And I would start by responding that in the kind of city that I have in my mind's eye, it would be really success will depend on a partnership between three categories of partner. The one would be, of course, the public authority, the local government itself, which has the regulatory and the legal authority. The second, of course, would be the private sector. But in many of the cities in which I'm talking about, the private sector will be found in the informal sector that I'm talking about. That is what the private sector looks like. It's not boardrooms and corporates. It's a very, very different scale. And the third category is, of course, organizations or community organizations that represent the interests of the residents themselves. Ultimately, you're looking to do a deal, a developmental and a political understanding between those three constituencies if you have any chance of making progress in a city. Which would, and that again comes back to my point, is if you want to get the private sector engaged, they are not going to engage whether they're small or big unless the investment climate is right. And the investment climate is not huge regulation, it's the message coming from all of the leaders in that local authority about permanence, about inclusion, about we're here together, and I don't want to make it sound warm and fuzzy, but you don't invest when you're going to be evicted the next morning. Or there is that danger. And so it's really changing that mindset that is, I think, the essential condition within which you can hope for private sector investment. The reality, though, and this is the point about the linear progression of housing and city growth, is what makes the cities different is, I think, the point has already been made about the pace, the numbers, which are very different. I mean, just to throw out one statistic, the secondary cities in Uganda, which is where the bulk of urbanization will take place, the 13 secondary cities, are expected to double in the next 15 years. So where's the rule book on how to manage that? It hasn't been written because no one's done it with that lack of resources. So the second non-linear and non-comparator is the extent of the poverty, both of the residents themselves that are urbanizing, because it's overwhelmingly only poor people that are urbanizing, and the poverty of the local authority that is receiving them. So there's a real double whammy there. That is the reality of urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And the third is just the scale. If you want to respond with interventions by a local government that can respond, very different from, say, post-war Europe, where you've got, or similar examples where you've got 10 or 20% of the population unhoused. Very different policy challenge when it's 80% of the city is a slum. And then, of course, you go back to that resource constraint that I'm talking about. So the key in terms of good policy is how do we connect three essential elements for success, assuming you have an investment climate that makes sense. And the three elements that I would focus on are, number one, savings that you want to promote, generate, and utilize. The second is subsidy. There has to be some way to ameliorate the poverty of the bulk of the population and, of course, the local authority. And the third is credit. How to get new money flowing through the system. That's easy to state, very, very difficult to manage. And that's where I believe that the questioner raised two of the keys to success, which is, or parts of the keys to success is one is a focus on appropriate forms of credit, which is microcredit, and not focusing on mortgage. This is not a mortgage market we're talking about at all. And the other is very much to focus on the role of women as a developmental vector, because there is very clear evidence that investment in women in development is far more profitable, I hate to say, than investing in men. And that is a worldwide rule that applies even in the United States. No, thank you. It wasn't an attempt for a vote. We also need to rethink. You know, we talk about we need affordable housing for the poor is something I've heard so often. At this point in time, the shack is the affordable housing. That's our starting point. There's no something else called affordable. That's what the poor can afford. The question is how to help them improve that stock so the affordable housing becomes nice housing. But at the moment, that's the physical manifestation of what is affordable, is a shack under current conditions. That's our starting point, which leads me back to the question that was raised about titling and DeSoto. I think DeSoto has raised very challenging and I think largely correct themes which are quite similar to the ones that I was addressing about inclusion and focusing on the resources that are there already existing in communities. Titling, in my view, is a little bit of a red herring. Titling is not a realistic option anytime soon in the majority of cities in the developing world. It's just not going to happen for very practical reasons about the state of the cadastre, the state of the administration, dispute resolution mechanisms, the legal constraints. I can give you many, many examples. The key challenge is to put into people's heads that where they are is recognized and is secure. And that can be achieved in a variety of ways, formal and informal.
Larry?
Yeah. Well, the advantage of going last is, of course, I can tell you I agree with all the things that both my co-panelists said. Rosemary, I don't know how to raise funding for your organization, but I can tell you that our experience in your country, in South Africa, throughout the subcontinent, but particularly in India, tells me that you've got a good model. And my favorite phrase comes from our South African friends who call their organization that's about women, about savings clubs, and about the kind of things you mentioned. They call it well-organized men. That's what women stands for. And I said, that tells the whole story to me. Coming to Steve's question on the private sector, there's no local government in the world that isn't kind of tuned into this idea that they can't do these things on their own, whether it's the way they approach financial institutions or even the way they farm out part of the responsibilities they have. I'm afraid we're still stuck at the point where the question I get most often from local officials is, what kind of PPP should we do? Public-private partnership. I think the question's much bigger than that. And what will drive this issue going forward is something I mentioned in my remarks earlier, and that is the need to be fiscally responsible, the need to have fiscal balance. Once you take that seriously, you can't begin to imagine that you can do this all by yourself. And I would add my endorsement to Billy's comments. I used to give DeSoto speeches for him, so my comment is, of course we believe in what DeSoto had to say. I think it's too narrow. He emphasized a lot the story about how everyone could go out and get a mortgage once they had a title. This turns out to not even be the first part of the story. And I guess just to make it quick, I think this idea that broader rights or urban citizenship or recognition of the right of people to be where they are is really the larger story that surrounds the narrower message that DeSoto delivered. I'm not as pessimistic as Billy is about, or I put it this way, we shouldn't give up on fixing the land titling and cadastral systems. That would be a mistake. You're right, Jane. Technology is changing things. I mean, most of the world, does their banking with their cell phone now. We find in the strangest places people are talking to their local government maybe as text. Actually, texting is much more common outside the U.S. than it is here. When we were down in Sichuan right after the earthquake, some of my American friends called me and said, is there a possibility to help them restore their phone system? They had it all in China. They had it all back up one day after the earthquake. That's how long it took. That's how important the technology was in terms of their ability to talk to the citizens and get on with the problem of fixing it. So it's inevitable. I don't have any advice on. I recognize the emotional distress you mentioned from your interviews. We've all talked to these people, and it's these are earth-shattering changes in terms of the speed and the magnitude of them. How you address that sort of problem, I don't have any idea. Thanks.
Chris, yeah, we'll run over for a minute or two. I don't know if we have a mic. We'll have to depend on the volume of your voice to reach the streaming. Here comes the mic.
You're out of time. It's not coming to you.
Well, there goes the mic.
I have a last question. My name is Nicholas Santiolo. I'm from the George Washington University Business School. And I just wanted to ask, how closely do you feel that urbanization and how closely, do you feel that urbanization and international equality are inversely related regarding race and gender and socioeconomic standing, and could urbanization lead to more inequality amongst the nation?
I guess we're near the end here, and I'd ask that
we're going to take this question.
We'll take the question. But anybody who has a statement to make that they think is very important to this issue, this would be the time to do so. Then we'll cut it off. Chris?
The president just came out with a pretty massive new global development policy, very focused on economic growth. Yet, as best I can tell, the State Department can't find a home for any sort of urbanization policy. USAID has 3.5 staff focused on urban housing issues. The MCC doesn't have an expert on urban issues. I think that they're doing some unique things in urban areas, but it certainly isn't in the mindset. I don't know if the process in which they came out on the side of the economic growth equation in their development policy included anybody with an urban lens. And in essentially what is the most clearly focused approach to a large-scale focus in terms of U.S. foreign assistance to Haiti, it's a large response is related to rural development and ag development. So my question is, what's the disconnect? What's missing in these two things? Is there a disconnect? Should the focus be on rural development at the same time on urban development? Should there be much more of a greater focus on urban development in these contexts? What is really missing in the U.S. foreign policy community in the sense that there's basically no capacity to deal with these issues?
Okay, anyone else?
Hi, Aditya Pant from MIT. My question was really from Billy was on the question of scale. We know the challenges of governance. We know reorganizing land markets, recognizing urban citizenship is of governance. But where do we begin is the question. Do we begin at the local level and try and create a model locality, model municipality, or do we begin at the national level but confront the challenges of implementation and low accountability? Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick question for Ms. Larson. So I really appreciated your giving, as you said, texture to the issue. The question is, why Chong Chang? And what does that say about the process of urbanization? The old line, of all the gin mills in all the world, you had to walk into this one. Of all the towns in all the world, 32 million people walked into that one. How did that happen? What are the reasons for it? What does that say about urbanization in general?
Hi, I'm Susan Winterberg from Habaco Planning and Architecture. It's a Canadian firm. And I'll make a quick statement, not necessarily a question, but addressing Mr. Hanna's ideas on how to promote cities as an engine of growth. I think one of the models we really haven't talked about is the East Asian economic miracle, and primarily Korea and Japan. I think it's well understood among macroeconomists what the formula was that led to their rapid growth after World War II. But as much as it was macroeconomic policy, it was also their urbanization policy. And I think that's a model that's a bit more relevant for the developing world today than sort of how the Western process happened, which was much longer. It took centuries. Theirs happened in under 10 years. So I think that's worth exploring. And also, just to add to the other comments that were made about De Soto's work, I just want to add that the panelists are correct. And I actually did my research on the impacts of his program in Peru, and I'm happy to share that paper if anyone wants to know what happened after they gave out all those land titles.
Okay, so panel, let's take a quick shot, a 2-minute shot at commenting on the last few things that were said, then we'll wrap it up. Larry, we'll reverse.
Okay, these are all big questions. Let me take the easy one. Yeah, we're all very much tuned into the East Asian story, and I agree with you. I used to be a senior fellow at KDI in Korea in the 70s when all of this was happening. The economy was growing quickly, and we were quite interested. I agree with you. Which one should go back to? The rural urban one, I think Chris, the person's name, asked that question. You'll see, and I think everybody mentioned this in their talk today, that this idea that this is a continuum and that you can't talk about one without the other is right. That doesn't mean all the policies are organized that way, but I think all of us here certainly believe that that modality is the right way to go. This inequality question. If you go back and look at the literature, they all argue that when you started to grow, inequality would rise, and then when you reached a certain level of income, it would begin to decline. There's a lot of new research on this, and it doesn't really change the fundamental assumptions. So I guess it's too tricky a question to talk about just in a couple of minutes here, but it is relevant, and it's, I guess the point I would emphasize is it's subject to the kind of policies you follow. I mean, one of the, coming back to, let's say, the East Asian miracle, one of the reasons the income distribution looks so good in Taiwan and in South Korea, Japan's a little bit different story, is that the way they grew was very labor-intensive manufactured exports, and that distributed the income that was accompanied by very rapid urbanization very widely. So they're almost unprecedentedly equal stories of equality during unprecedentedly rapid growth.
Three huge on the rural-urban. Again, it's not a competition, and I would be very much in favor, as an unashamed urbanist, for continued investment in rural areas, but for the right reasons. I mean, this must be because it makes economic sense, and not as an attempt to prevent urbanization, which is what often determines it. But ultimately, and this is the evidence that the World Development Report 2009 did bring, if you want to lift an entire nation out of poverty, then you do need your cities firing on all cylinders, and only really urban economic growth has the ability to lift both urban and rural populations out of poverty. So the maxim that I always have is the key to rural poverty alleviation is most probably better urban growth, and it's one economy, and it's one set of poverty indicators that you're trying to address. On the issue of the urbanization and the inequality, interesting question, but in my view too narrow, because there almost certainly will be increased inequalities, and then spreading. It depends on how the society is structured and the policies are administered. But what we do know from history is that if you want to look at the long trends of modernization, of democratization, and, for example, emancipating women, then that happens in cities as a general rule. And so it's a much broader debate about how societies change. And this is not understood properly about urbanization. This isn't just a demographic move. This changes societies forever. And that is why it is often resisted. But it is ultimately, if properly managed, and the debate we're really having, as far as I'm concerned, is how to get it right, how to get the cities right so that they offer hope rather than the kind of despair that we assume that they are all offering uniformly to others. On the U.S., is there a disconnect? There's a huge disconnect, but the U.S. is not alone. There are a number of the points that I made about accepting urbanization and getting its role right in development policy is a local policy, it's a national policy, and it's an international policy. And that's one of the battles that we're all fighting. And so the fact that the U.S. is not alone, it doesn't help us, but it should help promote the debate. There's not only a disconnect in the United States. Many development agencies still have a very polarized view of development, which does, even though they say it doesn't, segment rural policy and urban policy in a way that is actually completely inconsistent with their own economies in every case. So when the Brookings Institute refers to not the United States of America, but the United Cities of America as a way to understand the economy, why would it be different anywhere else in the world?
Great. I'm glad you addressed that question. I thought that was really important, and I was thinking that I felt bad I didn't have an answer because it's something that we wish there was a lot greater attention to. As one sort of hopeful note, I do note that Rajiv Shah, the head of USAID, is talking more about the role that science and technology can play in trying to do more with limited budget. It's a difficult economic time. The other thing I wanted to note is just in sort of discussions about foreign policy articles, people bringing us ideas, I'm hearing more and more talk about urbanization. I mean, that's part of obviously what gave rise to us doing this issue. I do think it takes a while for mindsets to change, and as you know, any kind of community grows up, people are trained in a certain way, certain thinking about problems. What is development? They have a definition. There's an evolution, and so I'm glad that conversations like this are happening, to beginning to widen the perspective of what's included. The question that I was asked specifically, why Chong Chang? And you're absolutely right. I could have written a story that would be very different, but in some ways similar in purpose for many cities. But the reason I picked Chong Chang, there are in China 4 what are called direct cities. These are cities that have an elevated status, that are able to get money directly from the central government, and in some ways are laboratories of urbanization. Beijing and Shanghai are 2 because they're so big. Tianjin is another city. The only direct city in central China is Chongqing. And the reason that's the case, actually, Chongqing is located on the Yangtze River. It's just upstream from where Three Gorges Dam was built. And during the construction of Three Gorges Dam, which was approved in 1992 and happened for the most part in the 1990s, all these people were displaced, and they had to go somewhere. And it was this question of who's responsible? Is it the national government? This is a national program to build Three Gorges Dam, or is it the responsibility of localities? And so what they did is they elevated the city of Chongqing so that it could get direct funding, so that you could have a bit more local and national coordination on how to provide new housing and other facilities for some odd million people who had to move. Another reason, though, that I think Chongqing, if that's in the past, that we'll hear more about Chongqing in the future, is because I think the next phase of the China story will be about the rise of central China. Most of the cities that we're familiar with are cities on the relatively prosperous East Coast, especially the Southeast. A lot of cities that have grown because of manufacturing, the sort of factory of the world. More and more companies like HP and Ford are locating manufacturing facilities in central China, Chongqing being one example. So I think it's a way to look at the, sort of where China's come, but also a way to pivot to where China's going. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to comment on the Habitat for Humanity statement, and I think it's right on the money. That is, we can now see the awareness of urbanization through significant parts of the development community, particularly the multilateral organizations, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asia Development Bank, UN Habitat, have sort of got the message. They have their own problems with within their own organizations and getting a fair share of the budgets, but they've got the right message. Within the executive branch, we really have a long way to go with the message. We don't have a spokesman. We don't have a champion. We do have champions in very important positions on the Hill. And I think the most important missing ingredient right now in our goal to focus the international community, but it's also true in any particular city or country in which you're seeking to address this problem, you need the political will. You need a consensus among what it is that constitute a decision by that society, and that's what we're lacking. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming here. We hope it's a small step in the right direction, and we much appreciate your